Welcome back to Pocket Pulp. Eric Brian Moore here, your host, ready to share another fantastic story with you this week. On today's episode, I'm excited to share Einyne's Tale by Dartanyan Johnson. Dartanyan is the author of the Crystal of Life series, or the Creston Kingdom series. You can find that on Amazon, or you can also check out the prequel on Audible, and it's called The Story of Shael. And I just listened to the sample, and it sounds amazing. The narrator, Dallin Bradford, whom I haven't listened to before, but he sounds like he knows his business, man. He sounds good, and the story sounds good, so I'm definitely going to check that out, and I recommend you do the same. So you can check Dartanyan out there. You can also check him out on Amazon, where if you look at his profile, it reads, "Tears will be shed, hearts will be broken, the weak will not survive this journey," which might be my favorite author profile ever. You can also follow Dartanyan on the Twitter at author3D Johnson. 3 with the number, at author3D Johnson. All right, if you like what we're doing here at Pocket Pulp, please rate, review, subscribe, and definitely share. And now, Einyne's Tale, a Crestonian short story, written by Dartanyan Johnson, narrated by Eric Brian Moore. There was once a boy named Einyne who had wandered deep into the woods in search of small animal friends to play with. Unfortunately, all the critters he encountered scurried away before he could gather them in his hands. Several paused when he crouched to their level, but didn't stick around long enough to hear his persuasive speech. "Almost," he said, watching the last of the tiny creatures fade into the woods. Einyne lost track of time, not realizing how late it had gotten until the bright blue sky had darkened to a bleak black and purple. Unable to remember the route home, he wandered in the wrong direction. Eventually, he stumbled across the mouth of an eerie cave. Little did he know it was no ordinary cave, for it belonged to an unsightly beast that loved to eat Crestonian children. Ignoring the strange aura surrounding the cave, Einyne peered thoughtfully into the black hole, then nodded his resolve. His adventure had not come to an end just yet. He was about to step inside, but before he entered, he heard shouts calling his name. Recognizing the voices, he stepped away from the cave and saw his parents looking at him, wearing expressions that were one part relief and one part outrage. He knew a scolding was soon to follow. Despite that, he ran to his mother, a grin on his face. His glee diminished as he took in her horrified gaze. She was looking over his shoulder. His father, wearing a similar expression, pulled out his small boning knife. Suddenly, the mother ran to her son and tossed him aside. Einyne rolled on the ground, confused by the treatment. When his eyes landed on his mother, genuine fear enveloped him. He watched as a large, toothy monster with blazing red eyes lunged at her, tearing flesh from her body with a swipe of its finger-length claws. Einyne's father pounced on the beast, stabbing it over and over while shouting something to the boy. It took Einyne a moment to understand his father was telling him to run. Annoyed by the father's attacks, the beast averted its attention from the dead woman. The shrieking screams Einyne's father produced when the beast ripped off his arm with its powerful jaws knocked Einyne from his stupor. The boy turned and ran. He still had no idea where home was, but that no longer mattered. Einyne was not sure how long he ran, but eventually his pounding footsteps weren't the only ones that filled the quiet night. Despite the terror fueling his adrenaline, his little legs could not churn fast enough to outrun the gaining beast. Einyne's lungs burned, and his heart thumped violently. But fear would not allow him to give in to the inevitable, not yet. He barreled through a thicket of bushes, receiving scrapes and slashes across his face and arms, then stepped awkwardly on a rock hidden in a puddle of mud, twisting his ankle. He tumbled to the ground with a yelp. The boy turned his head and glimpsed the beast. its bloody maw dripping blood under the moonlight. Its dingy light brown fur was matted with the juices of its most recent kill, and with each lurking step, its long, curled claws made impressions in the ground as the pads of its paws landed. Unable to assemble the will to escape, Einyne squeezed his eyes shut and waited for his life to come to a painful end. Then, through closed lids, he saw a bright light, followed by a rush of scorching air and the smell of burning flesh. The beast howled in agony, and Einyne, curious child that he was, opened his eyes to see what had happened. The monster was fleeing. He turned and noticed a woman wearing a thick cloak, pointing an accusatory finger in the beast's direction.
"This is the last time I'm going to warn you about trespassing into my territory, you Zingus," the woman called.
Shaking her head, she made to turn, but movement tugged her gaze toward the curled-up Einyne, whose expression was one between bewilderment and adoration.
"Hello, child," the woman said,
looking just as bemused.
"I didn't see you there."
She approached the boy and held out a hand. He took it, wincing as he got to his feet.
"Are you all right?"
the woman asked, and the young boy nodded. Then, face contorting, he shook his head as the entire situation washed over him, tears racing down his cheeks as he cried.
There,
she said, holding him close, letting his tears and snot smear on her fur cloak.
"You can tell old Tabby what's wrong."
Sputtering, the boy explained what had happened to his parents, and after admitting he had no other family, she vowed to take him in as her own. With that, they were off, trekking through the woods for what felt to Einyne like an eternity. Finally, the duo stopped before a boulder just tall enough to make him crane his neck to see the top. Tabby smiled at Einyne, then noticed his confusion.
"Oh, I forgot."
She tapped his forehead with her pointer finger, and the rock morphed into a modestly sized cabin.
"Better?"
she asked. He was so stunned. All he could manage was a jaw-dropped expression.
"I'm not really a people person," she admitted, as his mind tried to wrap itself around the woman's magical feat.
Einyne was grateful for the woman, but as the days passed, the memory of his parents' death continued to haunt him, and every night he would jerk awake in a cold sweat. To relieve some of his anguish, the old woman decided to give him a gift, a sword that would help him vanquish evil if he and evil should ever cross paths again. Since the sword was magical, it had to be stored somewhere special. Einyne's eyes lit up at the news. "A magic sword? For fighting evil?" Yersinia Suralis, Tabby for short, could tell by his expression he was already contemplating avenging his parents.
"Yes, Einyne," she told him. "The true magic activates when it's utilized in the hands of a worthy warrior, and only in the presence of evil."
She cocked her head then, a warning in her expression.
"This sword is for protection only. Don't go whipping it out every time you're upset."
Einyne nodded, then frowned. "How will I know if I'm in the presence of evil?"
"That's a great question," she said. "Your sword will let you know when it's time to be summoned."
Einyne waited for further explanation, but she gave none.
"Now, give me your hand,"
she commanded, and he thrust it at her. Reaching behind her, she withdrew a knife. Einyne watched the knife blade warily, but he didn't wince or draw back when the tip of the blade closed in on his open palm.
"Trust me, Einyne," she assured him. "I won't do anything to hurt you."
Reluctantly, he nodded. Tabby began to chant something in a tongue Einyne didn't recognize and laid the flat side of the blade on his palm. The outer edges of the knife radiated a bright blue, and Einyne gasped. She lifted the blade and cut a shallow pattern into his palm, a circle with an X through it, and a smaller circle in the middle of the X. He flinched reflexively, but calmed when no discomfort registered.
"I enchanted the knife so you'd feel no pain," Tabby explained. "Now, don't close your hand."
She stood and dug in the pouch at her hip belt. It was no bigger than a man's fist, but she was already in elbow deep as she searched for the sword with furrowed brows.
"Always making things so difficult," she muttered,
then said in an authoritative voice,
"Darastrix Sventar Anish."
Her face brightened as she pulled out a sword with a black scaly hilt and a gleaming hunter-green blade. Energy vibrated from the sword in a soft hum.
"Not bad, huh, Einyne?"
she asked as he marveled at the weapon.
"I take it you like it?"
Pressing the side of the blade to the mark on his bloody palm, she shouted,
"Loret!"
in that same commanding voice, and the sword became mist funneling into the boy's hand. Tabby nodded approvingly, as though satisfied by the outcome of a dessert dish.
"Can you feel its presence?"
Staring at the mark on his now healed palm, he opened and closed his hand. Einyne was so transfixed by what had happened it took him a while to respond. I can. How did you do that?"
"I'll teach you the incantation one day, just in case you need to reseal the mark."
"Incantation?" he repeated. It was clear he had no idea what she was talking about.
"We'll talk about it later," she said with a dismissive wave.
Later that night, Einyne sat at the table awaiting his dinner, still staring at the mark on his palm, while Tabby stared at the pie she'd pulled from the wood stove in dismay. Unlike her prior meals, the food was not magically prepped, so the result was something of a mystery. The black crust surrounding the not-quite-cooked center of the pie was confirmation that culinary arts were even harder to grasp than sorcery. Still, the boy ate his dinner like it was the greatest meal he ever had. And that was just the beginning of his rising appetite. Through the years, it became something monstrous, fuel for his ever-growing body, and young boy Einyne soon transformed into young man Einyne. He grew tall, and his once frail frame thickened with lean muscles from the strenuous exercises he performed in preparation for the next time he encountered the beast. Einyne had occasionally ventured to the cave where he believed the Zyngus resided, but no matter how far he dove into the dwelling, he failed to find his parents' killer. Apparently, the beast had left the cave and found victims to torment elsewhere. Eventually, his desire to slay the beast hit a dead end. After watching him mope around for weeks, Tabby suggested he should find something to do with his life, or else his disappointment would send him into a deep depression. She had heard of a small fishing village far beyond the mountains that encompassed their forest that might welcome strangers with skills like his. Tabby had showed him how to skin a small rodent only once, and he quickly mastered the technique. Einyne's steady hands and strong hand-eye coordination made him formidable with a knife. She was confident that with those qualities alone, he'd make a fine fishmonger. Accepting her advice, he packed, shared a heartfelt goodbye, and set out on his adventure. Several weeks later, he waltzed into the small fishing village Tabby had recommended. "Elgathan," he said, reading the worn wooden sign on a post that leaned slightly to one side. He met a group of fishermen that listened to his petition for work, any work, and kindly redirected him to a man named Cap. "That's what they call me round these parts." Cap was short, but powerfully built. His lavender skin was a shade darker than Einyne's, and his graying, unkempt hair stopped at his shoulders. The stubble that climbed high on his cheeks and his kind eyes reminded Einyne so much of his father. "So you're looking for work, and you're good with a blade?" Cap asked, repeating Einyne's declaration as he rubbed his chin contemplatively. The following silence ensued for a long time, and Einyne mentally prepared himself for a rejection. Then Cap's lips curved upward, and Einyne sighed in relief. "We'll see about those skills of yours," the man said. Since Einyne didn't have a place to call his own, Cap welcomed him to his small basement at an affordable rate. Cap lived with his wife, Shell, toddler son, Eldanor, and ravishing daughter, Reiki, who was preparing to leave before the start of the cold season to study medicine abroad. Einyne's skill with a blade was put to the test when a large shipment of various aquatic beasts was dropped off at the pier to be gutted, cleaned, and chopped into manageable pieces for sale to nearby villagers. After a quick anatomy lesson, Einyne tried his hand deboning the catch. By Cap's astonished expression as he examined the stacked fillet, Einyne knew he had found his place among the villagers. Having finally saved up enough money for his own living quarters several months later, Einyne had planned to move, but Cap insisted he stay and help with household tasks in exchange for the rent. Thankful, he accepted. Days bled into nights, then seamlessly merged into seasons, and before he knew it, 7 years had gone by. One gloomy evening, as they hauled in a great load, a fisherman asked another, "Have you heard about Kinsel's little boy?" Einyne's ears perked up as he gathered his share onto a cart. "Kinsel's boy?" the other man asked. "What happened?" Other fishermen slowed so they could better eavesdrop. "Word has it he left to play in the woods and was never seen again," the man said, shaking his head with a solemn expression. "He has been missing for 2 days." "He went missing in those woods?" Einyne interjected, gesturing to the forest in the background. It was one of Eldanor's favorite places to play, considered to be safe given the lack of predators. "Those be the ones," the fisherman confirmed warily. "If he's not found in the next day or 2, I say we organize our own search party." "Count me in," Cap said. "You know I'm all about the community," another fisherman said. "I'll be there. Just tell me when and where." That was followed by the rest of the men, each one voicing their willingness to help find Kinsel's boy and bring him home safely. That night, Cap ordered his son to stay out of the woods because a child had gone missing. For added measure, Einyne tossed in a few fabricated horror stories. With an emphatic nod, the boy agreed. After a long day's work the following evening, Einyne and Cap stepped into the kitchen. Spinning toward them as they entered, hands fidgeting, voice shaking when she spoke, Shell asked Cap, "Have you seen our son?" With a sinking feeling, Einyne knew the young troublemaking, rock-throwing, adventure-seeking Eldanor had disregarded the warning. "No, we haven't," Cap said calmly. "But you know how Eldanor is. The boy's got his pa's sense of adventure." He chuckled and gazed at Einyne. His words might have been mirthful, but his eyes displayed his concern. Reading the expression, Einyne said, "Don't you worry, Shell. I'll fetch him, and we'll be back in no time." "I'll go with you," Cap insisted, dropping his tools on the floor. "No, I think it's best I go alone." "Nonsense. We can cover more ground if we go together." That was true, of course, but as he looked from Cap to Shell, Einyne's childhood trauma with the monster that killed his parents niggled its way into the forefront of his thoughts. "It's okay, Cap," he assured, clapping a hand on the husky man's shoulder. "Stay here with Shell. I'll bring Eldanor back. If he sees you out looking for him, he might think he's in trouble and try to hide." "Believe me," Shell chimed in, "he's in very big trouble." Very well," Cap conceded with a sigh. "But if you aren't back by the time dinner's done, I'm coming after you." "Agreed." Einyne made himself a torch and brandished a knife. He wasn't planning to use the knife in the face of danger, but it showed Cap he meant business, especially since Cap was unaware of the sword that was itching to be summoned in Einyne's hand. Moments later, he parted with a nod. The forest bordering the fishing village of Elgathan had tall trees with thick, umbrella-like crowns that blocked most of the moonlight, rendering the area particularly eerie to Einyne. The torch's wavering light seemed to only illuminate himself. He realized, stepping into the forest, if there was a predator lurking about, he'd be foolishly announcing himself with a beacon. Considering that fact, howling Eldinor's name couldn't be that much worse. "Eldinor," he called out, then waited, scanning the area the best he could. There was no response. The moonlight shifted with each passing hour, and Einyne knew Cap could appear at any moment. "Eldinor!" he bellowed with great urgency. "Where is that insolent boy?" He had told Eldinor about the potential danger in the forest so he could stay away from the threat, and what did the boy do instead? Einyne halted and stared into the surrounding darkness, trying hard not to focus on the growing sense of foreboding. With the torch held high, he slowly rotated until he was facing the way he'd come. The village was nothing more than a faint flicker of lights. Sighing, he prepared to continue his search, his lips forming to yell the boy's name again, when he thought he noticed 2 white orbs among the bushes. He furrowed his brow, then stalked toward the bush. He was about to claim it as a figment of his imagination until the orbs blinked. "Eldinor," he called, and the orbs grew twofold. Eldinor's face peeked through the shrubs, looking like he wanted to say something, but his eyes darted toward something behind Einyne, and fear held his tongue. Einyne stilled. He wasn't sure if it was an instinctual sensation or possibly the shift in the wind, but he knew before he turned back around what crept toward him. The Zyngus stood on all fours, its mouth drooling saliva. Though the creature's bared teeth were a woeful sight, what impeded Einyne's progress from summoning his sword were the Zingus's burning red eyes. He'd dreamt of this very moment, face to face with his parents' killer. But as he peered at the creature's snarl, a familiar cold sweat chilled him. He was a child again, and there was no Tabby to save him this time. The Zyngus kept its distance, despite Einyne making himself an easy meal, and sniffed the air. Its head tilted until it was facing Eldinor's hidden location. Ignoring Einyne, it stalked toward the young boy. It took Einyne a moment to realize the Zyngus was probably wary of the fire he held. Whether it was the brightness of the light or remembering its encounter with Tabby, Einyne didn't know. But as he watched the monster inch toward the boy that had become his family over the years, a burning sensation in his right palm edged him from his stupor. He would not let this monster hurt the people he loved ever again. He took one determined step forward, then another. Eldinor rose to run from the nearing beast when a green glow grabbed his attention. The Zyngus, also snared by the light, turned with a look of horror on its already horrid face. A steady hum of energy emanated from the sword as Einyne held it overhead. This is new, he thought. He had practiced swinging his weapon often, but it had never glowed before. Then he remembered Tabby's words. The true magic activates when it's utilized in the hands of a worthy warrior and only in the presence of evil, and charged. He expected the Zyngus to meet him in a bloody battle, but the creature turned and scampered through the trees. To Einyne's surprise, the sword began to tug him toward the fleeing creature. He tried to hold the weapon steady, but the sword continued to sway from side to side while pulling him forward, forcing him to give chase. "What are you doing?" he asked the sword as it gained speed. He tried to release his grip, but his fingers were glued to the hilt. Scrambling for footing, his toes dragged along the ground before leaving the ground altogether. Einyne flew through the forest and in short time caught up to the beast. The Zyngus, knowing it could not outrun the flying duo of man and sword, faced Einyne, standing in a two-legged pose of defiance. It roared and tried to swipe at the weapon, but the glowing sword plunged itself into the monster's chest unhampered. With a crackling sound, the Zingus's skin illuminated like a lantern. Beams of light escaped from the monster's eyes, mouth, ears, and nostrils. Suddenly, the Zyngus blew away as a puff of ashes on the wind casting Einyne into darkness. Now that the threat was gone, the sword formed into mist and funneled back into his hand. A bouncing orange glow caught his attention. Eldanor trudged toward him with the torch Einyne had dropped while trying to slow the sword's momentum. When Eldanor finally reached him, the boy was gasping for air, wearing an expression of utter amazement. Einyne allowed his anger to surface now that they were both safe. "I thought I told you to stay out of the woods." Eldanor blinked several times, eyes fixed on Einyne's hand. "Do you know how much trouble you're going to be in when you get home? Your parents are worried about you," he added. At the mention of his parents, despair began to take precedence, and the young boy finally met Einyne's disappointed gaze. "Why didn't you listen to me, Eldanor? You could have been killed just now." Eyes falling to the ground, Eldanor remained quiet. Sighing, Einyne took the torch from Eldanor and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder, squeezing it slightly. He was still upset, but the fact the boy was still alive put him at ease. "Come on," he said, guiding Eldanor in the direction of the village lights. "Let's go home." The Zingus's lover lurked in the darkness as the two Crestonians walked away. When she had noticed a strange yet familiar energy as she awaited her mate's return from his hunt, she ran as far away as possible. She didn't stop running until she could no longer sense the power. When she believed it was safe, she charged back to search for his body. If he was dead, there was no need to waste the good meat his carcass would provide. Their offspring would be grateful for the hearty meal. However, she couldn't get a scent of him on the wind. When the two retreating figures disappeared from view, she made her way back to the cave. With the loss of her provider, she would have to do the hunting now. Unlike him, who had hunted mainly for sustenance, she liked to kill for the sake of spilling blood, and since she doubled the male in size, it would take many deaths to quench her thirst. Thank you for joining us again this week. I hope you enjoyed Einyne's Tale by Dartanyan Johnson. Be sure to check Dartanyan out on Amazon and on Audible, or if you're into the whole tweetverse, check him out on Twitter at author3djohnson. If you enjoy stories and you want to hear a new one each week, please subscribe and check us out on Facebook at Pocket Pulp, where we look forward to talking with and about the writers further. If you're a writer and would like to have your story featured on Pocket Pulp, contact us at pocketpulpsubmission@gmail.com. My name is Eric Brian Moore, Eric with a C, Brian with a Y, and you can also follow me on Twitter, where I usually don't say anything, or you can check out my website for more samples of my work. Music by Bluemont Score and Eternal Producer from Pixabay. Thank you for joining us. I look forward to reading you another fantastic story next week.